No one, least of all Dr. Litchfield, came right out and told Ralph Robert that his wife was going to die. But there came a time where Ralph understood without needing to be told. The months between March and June were a jangling, screaming time inside his head. A time of conference with doctors, of evening runs to the hospital with Caroline, of trips to other hospitals in other states for special tests. Ralph spent much of his travel time on these trips thanking God for Caroline's Blue Cross major medical coverage, of personal research in the Derry Public Library, at first looking for answers the specialists might have overlooked, later on just looking for hope and grasping at straws. Stephen King's 21st novel, Insomnia, is a bit of a return to the norm for him when we get back to monsters that are inhuman and the people who are caught in their web. Not only that, it's also a return to a town that is very well known for constant readers, and well, let's be honest, general public thanks to the 2 recent remakes of it. Yes, we're going back to Derry because it, Pennywise, may be gone. Maybe. But the town still hasn't been freed of all evil. On the other hand, there's also a couple of new tricks in the novel that we haven't seen before. While Dolores Claiborne had Dolores tell her story as an elder woman with grown children, most of the action happens when she was younger. Ralph Roberts, on the other hand, is in his late 60s, and thus is the first main character, Yes Hey Hey, that King writes that it's not in his 30s. And while the main plot is quite supernatural, there is a subplot equally important that is as mundane as the plot both in Gerald's Game and Dolores Claiborne, because yes, once again we're going to talk about domestic violence. It was the bee under King's bonnet in the 90s. I am AdalisaZ, and I hope that you have some coffee at hand, because today we are not going to sleep at all as we try to understand Ralph's Insomnia. Although Insomnia is a return to the norm for King, it's also not a very good novel to start reading him because of all the connections it has to other books. It was published in 1994 and is the second novel of his that takes place in Derry. But besides that, it introduces many concepts of the greater mythology of the universe of all King's novels, tying every novel that has come before to the Dark Tower series. It is important to note that Insomnia was published in between the Dark Tower 3, The Wastelands, and the Dark Tower 4, Wizard and Glass, where such concepts were already introduced but not explained in great detail. I could spend this whole video, and probably other two, explaining those concepts. The idea of the multiverse in King's words, what the Dark Tower is exactly, and of course the idea of Ka, the wheel of fate that ties every single living being together, and of the Katet, the group of people with whom you have a common fate and work together towards that fate. To give an example of a previous novel, the losers from it are a Katet. But much more important for the subject matter of the novel, it also introduces the concept of purpose and random as 2 opposite forces, which are constantly at war while at the same time keeping balance in the universe. The purpose, or the white, is not quite good, but serves a reason, while the random, or the crimson, is always evil. Here we also have the first mention and appearance of the Dark Tower's greatest villain, the Crimson King, a shape-shifting creature, based of course in Derry. Shape-shifting is a time-honored tradition there, who wants nothing more than to destroy the Dark Tower for reasons of his own. And yet, none of that is the actual subject matter of the book, and I only mention them here because at least the purpose and the random will come up not just in the summary but in future books. No, the subject matter of the book, taking away all the mythology and the extra baggage, is once again the dangers of fanatism, in particular religious fanatism, and the true horrors of domestic violence. It is also the first novel in which King specifically talks about a current social issue, in this case, abortion rights, and the way he does it plants him firmly in the pro-choice side, painting a very stark image of how so-called pro-life activists tend to be only pro-life when the life they consider is valuable, not, pro-all life. In short, it's a heavy novel. But let's start with the actual plot before we start dissecting the message. After losing his wife to cancer, retired salesman Ralph Roberts starts suffering from insomnia, which shortens his sleep time from a normal 7 hours a night to barely 1 hour a night if he is lucky. At the same time, his neighbor, Ed Depenio, is getting strangely obsessed with the local women's center, convinced that they are forcing women to abort in order to use the fetal tissue for their own satanic purposes. Due to this belief, Ed badly beats his wife Ellen because she signed a petition for a famous feminist, Susan Day, to come to Derry to speak in favor of the women's center. With Ralph's help, Helen leaves Ed and goes to hide in the women's shelter that the women's center that she signed the petition for manages, but that puts Ralph in Ed's list of enemies as he starts calling Ralph on the phone, warning him about sticking his nose in long-term business and ranting about how Ralph is an evil centurion working for the Crimson King to help destroy mankind, and then, out of nowhere, asks if Ralph has started to see the colors. Ralph, at first, dismisses Ed as a nutcase and only calls the cop because he's afraid that Ed will try to hurt Ellen and their daughter Natalie even more. However, as his insomnia worsens, he realizes that the truth is somewhat worse. He too starts seeing the colors, auras that surround every living being on Derry, and with them, 3 little doctors who seem to be the ones who decides who lives and who dies. And one of them is dangerously mad. In the greater scope of King's novels, some people may say that yes, Insomnia is a good book to start if you want to get your foot wet with the lore of the Dark Tower. It is kind of important to it, as I mentioned, it introduced a few concepts that are incredibly important to the story of Roland of Gilead. Except, and I know I am in the minority here, the same concepts are actually also explained within the Dark Tower a little bit later, and the Crimson King appears again in the Dark Tower series, so reading this is more of a competition thing than an actual need if you are getting into King's lore. On the other hand, Insomnia is a very good book on its own terms, and the addition of the Dark Tower's lore and images doesn't really affect the narrative in a bad way. This is to say, you also don't need to have to read the 3 books of the Dark Tower that King had already written by this point to understand what is going on in Derry. It gives a bit of an extra if you know who Roland is and what the tower stands for, but it's not necessary to understand the plot of Insomnia. Now, speaking of Derry, yes, we will see some familiar faces here. Fortunately, not ones that change shape. Mike Hanlon has a short but important scene, and we get to meet Officer Snell's grandson. Not only that, but Insomnia contradicts a bit of it by letting us know that the losers didn't really forget each other completely, as they put money to make a statue in memoriam of those lost in the storm of 1985 when they finally won the fight against Pennywise. Which, okay, it's a bit of a retcon, but one that I think we all can live with because seriously, after all the losers went through, they totally deserve to keep their friendship at the very least. That said, as I mentioned, the true subject of Insomnia is once again domestic violence, only that this time is from the point of view of the onlookers. Oh, and the dangers of fanatism too, because we know that King do not like religious fanatism. Our onlooker is Ralph, of course, and he reacts to the situation between Helen and her husband Ed, the way in which probably most people would like to act upon seeing a woman so badly beaten that she might even lose an eye and is about to drop her baby girl on the street as she can't hold her long with her broken arms. Call the police, which in this case is thankfully competent and takes the side of the woman. However, as everybody tells him, that is not really a long-term solution to anything. At the beginning, Helen herself doesn't want him to call the cops, nor to send her to the hospital, and it takes another woman survivor taking to her to even consider a divorce or entertain the idea that if she goes back to Ed, next time he gets angry at her, he might kill her. This is unfortunately very common, and as Ralph Franz Bill points out, most women go back to their abusers, convinced by nice words and their own fears. Bill is incredibly cynic and doesn't really have the whole picture, but he's right. One of the reasons why battered women returns to their abusers is because they know that if they don't, they will be chased and things will get worse. Fortunately for everyone, this is not the case with Ellen, who, after talking to the concealer for the local women's shelter, who survived her own husband cutting her leg open with a knife, decides to leave Ed and go to Sage's shelter to try and rebuild her life. We will talk about those women who are chased later in a different book. Ironically, as Helen herself puts it, The reason why Ed had beaten her so badly in the first place was because she signed a petition for Safe Human Shelter to bring a famous activist to give a speech about the importance of keeping abortion clinics and reproductive service open in Derry, knowing that the shelter does more than just provide abortions to those who need them, and she ended up being precisely one of the women who needed those other services. Here's where the other subject matter of fanatism comes in. While King and the narrative is firmly pro-choice, it gives a lot of space to show how insane the discussion against abortion had gotten in the 90s. Ed is the worst, being that he's convinced that the women's shelter is not just providing abortions, but forcing women to abort left and right, killing hundreds, if not thousands of babies every day, and then putting their dead bodies on containers to ship all over the country to feed the centurions of the Kingdom King. With the Friends of Life, the group he originally joins once Helen divorces him, aren't that far away from his ideas, with the possible exception of the Crimson King part and the forced abortions. They seem to agree with him in everything else. At the time, it seemed like an exaggeration, given how fanatical the group seemed. Among their actions, one of the members tried to stab Ralph, as he had been labeled as Centurion by Ed, and later killed a pregnant woman because she was at the shelter, despite claiming to want to save babies. But now, we see that King was only portraying the way madness would increase, if we judge by the new reports we can see every day about the subject. The surprise comes with the fact that Ed is not really obsessed with getting Ellen back, as most abusers tend to do, but instead focused completely on stopping the activists from speaking up in Maine. And of course, that's when the tragedy comes in. As I pointed out, at first the arguments of the pro-life side here sound like a bad caricature of pro-lifers. There is not a single sympathetic one in the bunch, and even the moderate ones, the ones who disagree with the bombings and the more violent extremists, are still screeching about how abortion is always murder and women don't have the right to choose what happens with their own bodies. Not only that, they are actually unwilling to condemn the more violent of their members, in this case Ed and the 4 people he managed to convince of his crazy ideas, or their actions. An excellent example of this is when the media finally managed to interview the leader of the Friends of Life after there was a protest in which someone threw some horribly realistic dolls filled with blood to the women's centers outside the town hospital. Despite the reporter asking about it, the leader of the movement simply ignores her or insists that it was just a fringe member of the public who did that in order to make the Friends of Life look bad, a true anti-red technique that a lot of hate groups in real life use. He claims that the group is peaceful and only wants to protect children, but upon being asked if the Depenue could become more violent, he just replies that Ed is no longer with the association, never mentioning why. One can't avoid thinking that perhaps if the people who had been listening to Ed rant and yell about Susan Day, the feminist activist who is coming to speak about abortion for months, had mentioned to the police that the man really wanted to kill Susan and all her supporters, the tragedy at the end would have been avoided. However, all this doesn't mean that King puts all the pro-choice aside as complete saints that are always right. He actually makes a couple of very good points about how they can also have blind spots. At some point, Ralph and his friend Lois have to go to the women's center to try and get the address of the women's shelter that, for obvious reasons, is kept secret unless you actually need to go there as a refugee. It is there when Ralph realizes that he is seen with a lot of suspicion. But no one bats an eye to Lois putting her hand on her handbag to pull out something. The fact that the thing that she pulled out was a paper didn't really matter, as the woman in reception and the security guard didn't know that, and Lois could have been ready to get out a gun and no one would have been able to stop her until it was too late. But if he had done the same, then everyone would have been in their ward because he was a man. The first complaint could be dismissed as a man not getting it, a man trying to be treated like an ally just because, and hating the understandable suspicion that women who have suffered at the hand of men would have towards any man. However, a little later the women's shelter is attacked, and the reason why the attackers were able to get in was because the driver of their van was a woman, and thus no one looked a bit closer to it to notice the obvious pro-life bumper sticker on said van. It is then when we realize that Ralph's point wasn't that he shouldn't be looked at with suspicion. In fact, he's quite understanding when women don't trust him right away, but that Everyone should be looked at with suspicion if you are being under attack by crazy people who try to kill everyone they are against. It was not, why you suspect me only because I am a man, but why do you assume that every woman is on your side when you know it's not the case? Another important criticism is the one made against Susan Day, the very famous feminist activist whose visit is the climax of the whole novel, whom we never really met, and she meets a very grisly end. While the narrative and pretty much all the heroes in the novel agree with her message and know that it's necessary for people to hear it, the cop that is assigned to her security detail points out that she doesn't really understand the small town mentality and doesn't care that her visit at that particular point in time is like throwing a match into a powder keg. That she is only coming there to make herself look good and doesn't know nor care to find out the consequence that her visit may have, not just because of the violence that is increasing every day between the pro-choice and the pro-life groups, but also for how it's going to end up affecting the actual legislation that it's fought about. We never know if he is right and she is really a selfish person only looking for her 15 minutes of fame, but we know that that has been true for other grifters in both sides of the debate. To end things in a grim way, he also criticizes how politicians use the polarized argument in their benefit. See, all the situation with the women-centered protest is that there is a proposed law that would change the zoning of the land where it sits, making it impossible for them to provide abortions. A very true and tried strategy that has been used in a state like Texas, where they don't forbid the clinics but make it impossible for them to keep functioning thanks to a lot of regulations, including the size of hallways they have. Except that because this particular women's center is literally next door to the hospital, any legislation that stopped the women's center from working would also affect the hospital, so everyone knows that it's not going to happen. It's a non-issue, but politicians and activists alike are fueling the flames of the debate only to win more people to their side. And that dishonesty ends up causing people to die. Insomnia is a very good book, although it starts a bit slow. Besides the subject matter of domestic violence, it also deals with the fact that death comes from everyone, the slow process of aging, how other people see old people, and the duty one has to help others when it's needed. The Good Samaritan rule, so to speak. And yes, it also has a good deal of King's lore, which makes it a nice book for people who already love the King and his style, but perhaps not that good for your first King's book. Oh, and if you haven't started reading The Dark Tower, not a bad book to get a taste of what is going to come next there. I want to thank my dear patrons Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, Jessica, and Ali Riley, as well as my first supporter Tanya Pineda and Amy Sung, who is the best person in the universe and without whom these videos will not exist. I also want to remind you that if you want to support this and my other projects and get your name mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/AdalisaZ, written link on description, as I know my name can be hard to spell. And with just $1 a month, you will always be thanked in my videos, as well as to get access to a ton of art before anyone else. Or if you prefer a one-off offer, at Coffee with just one donation of $3, you will get a mention in the next 3 videos I make. If you can't support me this way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channel, and of course you sharing the links. I also welcome all your questions, feedbacks, and suggestions in the comments below. And now, well, we still have one more look at the women who have to survive the men they married and how they managed to do so. And for that, we're going to meet 2 roses. One who is looking to survive, and one who is always mother.